The bells of Florence rise before the sun. They tremble through the mist, across the Arno over-tiled roof still damp with night. Inside a narrow counting room near the Mercato Vecchio, a boy's fingers hover over neat stacks of gold florins. Candles spit and hiss. Wax drips like slow tears onto ledgers lined with tiny brown ink. Behind him, men speak in low voices of grain shipments in Venice, of debts owed in Rome, of a new commission for a chapel wall. The boy's name is not known to history, but the emblem above his head is. 6 round balls on a red shield, the crest of a family whose money will move like an invisible river through Europe. Their numbers will decide who builds domes and who goes hungry, which artist paints and which one fades into silence. In this room, art is not yet color and light. It is risk, ink, and handwriting that must never shake. Outside, Florence is raw. Guild banners hang heavy in the air. The wool workers cough in cramped workshops. Priests whisper against usury from marble pulpits, while merchants slip into back rooms to count interest under another name. The city wants beauty, but first, it needs credit. It needs someone willing to turn faith into figures. Soon, a name will thread through these ledgers. Medici. Bankers who will learn that a painting can be as sharp as a dagger, and a sculpture can be as powerful as an army. If stories of gold, power, and paint reshaping the fate of cities speak to you, you can like this video and stay with us on this journey into the world the Medici quietly built. The city of debts and dreams. Morning comes late to the narrow streets of Florence. The sun must fight its way down, slipping between overhanging roofs, touching first the highest windows and only slowly reaching the cobbles where people live their days. Before the light arrives, the city already breathes. Hooves strike stone. A cart creaks under sacks of raw wool, damp from river mist. A woman leans from an upper window to shake out a cloth, and dust drifts through a shaft of pale light like smoke in a forgotten chapel. Somewhere a bell rings a low, steady note, marking not holiness but habit. Time to open the shutters, time to count. In the Mercato Vecchio, the old market at the city's heart, stalls lift their wooden mouths and wake. The air thickens with the smell of sweat, onions, leather, and wool grease. Dyed cloth hangs like flags of another world, deep blues and reds, expensive colors that began as crushed insects and distant plants. Men call to each other in rough voices, arguing over the thickness of cloth with the same heat priests use for doctrine. Money changes hands so quickly that the clink of coins becomes a kind of music, always in the background, always playing. Florence calls itself a republic, but on mornings like this it feels more like a balance sheet. Every handshake has a number behind it. Every smile hides a calculation. The guilds, butchers, silk workers, wool merchants, bankers move through the streets in quiet rivalry, each one convinced that without their labor the whole city would fall. Above their shops, carved into stone or painted on wooden signs, symbols stare down like watchful eyes. Shears for the cloth makers, scales for the money changers. And more, a red shield marked with round balls like drops of sealing wax or solid blood, the young emblem of the Medici. Long before their name becomes legend, long before their palaces are filled with paintings, they are simply one family among many in this loud, hungry city. Their world is not yet marble and music. It is ink and wool and risk. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici walks through the market with his cloak drawn close, not to show pride but to avoid attention. To most observers he is an ordinary merchant, another man trying not to slip on the damp stones. Yet inside his mind, the city looks different. He does not see stalls and shouting. He sees flows of cloth, of grain, of silver, moving from hand to hand, city to city, like currents under the surface of the Arno. Giovanni has learned one hard truth: things move faster than coins. A cart of grain may leave Pisa for Florence long before the money to pay for it does. A Florentine wool dealer can promise to pay a Flemish supplier months from now in another town in another currency. Traders make these promises every day, betting their reputations on their word, but words can be broken, horses can fall, bandits can strike, kings can change the laws overnight. What the city needs, quietly, desperately, is someone who can turn promises into something more solid. Inside a cramped counting room off a side street, Giovanni begins to do exactly that. The room is low and smells of tallow and metal. The only window faces a wall so close that it admits light without a view, as if the world outside has been reduced to a simple, sour glow. On the table lie wooden tablets for calculation, an abacus, a handful of coins from different lands, and a single large ledger bound in leather, its pages still mostly empty. A customer arrives, shoulders dusted with the long road. He is a merchant of cloth, worried but trying not to show it. His shipment is ready in Bruges in the cold north, but his money is here in Florence. Sending gold across the length of Europe means risk. Sending himself means time. He sits, shifts on the bench, and finally asks if there is a way, any way, to turn Florentine florins into distant comfort without placing them on the back of a single mule. Giovanni listens more than he speaks. This is one of his gifts. When he finally answers, his solution sounds more like a blessing than a bargain. The merchant will deposit his money here in this quiet room. In return, he will receive a letter, carefully written, signed with the Medici name and mark. It will travel north faster and safer than any wagon of gold, tucked into other bundles, hidden in chests, protected by the fact that to most eyes it is just paper. When the merchant reaches Bruges, he will visit a partner house, show the letter, and receive his funds there. The Medici will adjust their books to match. No coins cross borders, but value flows all the same. To the man with dust on his shoes, it feels like a miracle. To Giovanni, it is simply mathematics wrapped in trust. Letters of credit, bills of exchange, deposits, and withdrawals written as neat lines of ink. These are the tools with which he will quietly reshape his city. Each entry in the ledger ties Florence to another point on the map. Rome, Venice, Geneva, London. Cities that would take weeks or months to reach by road are now joined in a single book, closed by a simple leather strap. Yet for all this cleverness, danger crouches nearby. The church preaches against usury, the sin of charging interest on loans. Sermons thunder against those who make money from money, warning of damnation in words that echo through stone naves and stained glass light. But the same church also needs bankers to move its own funds, pay for cathedrals, and support crusades and courts. It is a dance of denial and necessity. Giovanni must learn to move in that narrow space, to call interest by gentler names, to wrap profit in the language of service and stability. On some evenings, after the last customer has gone and the ledger has been closed for the day, Giovanni sits with a single candle and reads back through his own handwriting. Names, numbers, dates. A widow granted extra time to pay a small loan after her husband's sudden death. A wealthy nobleman borrowing against land to fund a distant war. A fellow merchant asking for a quiet favor that he does not want mentioned openly. Each line is a life, a thread. And Giovanni begins to see that by tugging on those threads, he can shift whole patterns without ever raising his voice. Outside, Florence argues with itself. In the piazzas, men shout over which faction should rule. In workshops, apprentices complain about long hours and poor pay. In great council halls, laws are proposed, rejected, revised. But in the Medici counting room, noise is kept outside the door. Here, power condenses into silence, into the scratch of a quill, the soft tap of an abacus bead, the quiet moment when two men look at each other and decide whether to trust. The city is still poor in many ways. Its streets flood when the river rises. Its people fall to plague and hunger. Yet in the ledger's pages, Florence is already becoming rich in something new, possibility. With each loan and letter, Giovanni is building more than a bank. He is building a web, fine as a spider's but strong enough to catch princes, popes, and painters. He does not yet know what images will hang from the strands he spins. He only knows that when people come to him with fear in their eyes and hope in their voices, he has the power to say yes or no. And somewhere, in that gap between yes and no, between promise and payment, the outlines of the future begin to appear. Domes that have not yet been planned, paintings that have not yet been imagined, a city not yet called the cradle of the Renaissance, waiting to be financed into existence. In the years that follow, the Medici name begins to move through Florence the way rumors do, quietly at first, then everywhere. A craftsman who was saved from ruin by a well-timed loan mentions Giovanni's kindness to his neighbor. A merchant returning from the fairs of Champagne tells of a Medici agent in a far-off city who honored a letter without hesitation. A priest struggling to repair a leaking roof over his church finds that the banker in the modest counting room is willing to help, provided the parish deposits its funds with his house. Each choice is small, almost invisible. Taken together, they start to tilt the whole city. Giovanni understands that money alone does not protect a man in Florence. This is a place where envy sharpens like a knife on every doorstep. The great families, the Albis. The Strozzi, the Pazzi watch each other as closely as they watch their ledgers. To rise too fast is to invite suspicion. So Giovanni moves carefully, always wearing the cloak of modesty. He dresses plainly. He avoids loud displays of wealth. He gives alms in ways that can be seen, but not flaunted. Yet he never forgets that beneath all this humility lies an ambition as precise as any column of numbers. One afternoon, when the counting room smells of ink and damp wool, a new kind of visitor arrives. A man in clerical black, bearing a letter sealed with wax. He brings news from Rome, from the very heart of the church. The papacy is troubled. Wars, alliances, construction all cost money. The Pope needs reliable bankers. The letter names the Medici among those considered for this sacred and dangerous work. To hold the keys to papal funds is to stand near a fire that can warm or consume. Giovanni reads the letter in silence. Around him, the world seems to narrow to the curve of each letter, the weight of each phrase. If he accepts, the Medici Bank will not simply handle the savings of merchants and widows. It will move the wealth of Christendom. It will pay for churches, for crusades, for crowns. It will be thanked from pulpits and cursed in whispers. It will be, in the eyes of many, the hand that helps God count. He says yes. The transformation is gradual but unmistakable. New branches open in strategic cities. Clerks are trained not just to count but to observe, to read the moods of markets and men. Letters bearing the Medici seal cross mountains and seas, dry and crackling from the cold of northern winters or smelling faintly of salt from Mediterranean ports. Each one carries instructions, reassurances, corrections. Extend this loan. Call in that debt. Favor this prince over that one. The decisions are written in careful, unhurried script, but beyond the ink lie real consequences. A mill that stays open or closes, a fortress that is built or never rises. In the evenings, when the city's noise fades to a softer murmur, Giovanni sometimes walks home with his young son at his side. Cosimo listens more than he talks, alert to everything. The way his father nods respectfully to certain men and only gives a cool glance to others. The way people straighten when Giovanni passes, grateful and wary in equal measure. The boy's shoes tap the cobbles in a slower rhythm as he looks up at the unfinished great dome of the cathedral, a wide hole in the sky that no one yet knows how to cover. Who will pay for it? Cosimo asks once, pointing at the enormous space waiting above the city. Giovanni's answer is not direct. Whoever understands that faith also needs stone, he replies, and that stone needs silver. Cosimo does not fully understand, but the words stay with him. He begins to see that every visible marvel, every chapel, every statue, every new bridge has an invisible twin in some ledger. Behind each work of beauty or power, there is always someone who decided to sign a line under credit and trust that the future would repay the risk. Inside the Medici house, the atmosphere is both domestic and quietly charged. Servants move with practiced steps. The kitchen smells of bread and herbs, but in a side room there is another kind of heartbeat, the pulse of commerce. On a table, small piles of coins wait to be counted. On the wall, a chest holds important papers. Cosimo, still young, is given his first simple tasks, copying figures, tallying small accounts, learning to keep his hands steady even when the numbers are large or the story behind them is troubling. He sees the range of human need pass through his family's hands. A guild master arrives to secure a loan that will keep many workers employed through a lean season. A nobleman, his voice tight, seeks funds to redeem land mortgaged in desperation. A widow, eyes red from sleepless nights, begs for more time. Cosimo notices how his father's face changes with each visitor, how he softens his tone for the desperate, hardens it for the proud, always aware that kindness and firmness are both tools in a banker's trade. Whispers begin to thicken in the streets. The Medici are becoming too powerful, some say. They deal with Rome itself. Old rivals grumble that a family of upstart merchants should not hold such sway. At feasts and in council meetings, names are spoken with forced smiles and tight jaws. Florence remembers its past, the riots of the wool workers, the sudden turns of fortune that have toppled once mighty houses, and those who feel threatened by the Medici start to wonder how long they should tolerate their rise. At the same time, ordinary citizens begin to see something else. When famine threatens, the Medici arrange grain shipments and extend credit to the government to buy food. When political crisis looms, they help cover emergency expenses, their money quietly filling gaps in the city's fragile finances. People grumble about banking as a sin on Sunday and stand in line to ask for loans on Monday. Resentment and gratitude mingle like smoke in the air, impossible to separate. One winter evening, as a cold wind knifes down from the hills, Giovanni coughs harder than usual. He is no longer young. The work that seemed light when he first opened his ledger now weighs on his lungs and bones. Illness has a way of entering houses in silence, setting itself down at the table uninvited. The servants move more carefully. The candle flames seem to burn lower. Cosimo watches his father's hands tremble slightly as he lifts a cup of watered wine. "Come here," Giovanni tells his son, when the room is quiet and the noise of the city has faded to a distant hum. On the table between them lies the great ledger, its pages now thick with years of business. The ink of early entries has faded to brown. Newer ones still shine black in the candlelight. "This," Giovanni says softly, laying his hand on the book, "is not just money. It is Florence. These lines are its fears, its hopes, its promises. If you hold this, you hold more than coins. You hold the trust of men who have staked their lives on our name." Cosimo looks down at the ledger and feels the weight of it, heavier than any chest of gold. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters. In the distance, a bell tolls the hour, each note hollow and final. Within a few years, Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici will be gone, his body buried with the honors due to a respected citizen, his soul commended to God by priests who once warned against men like him. But his true monument will not be the stone above his grave. It will be the living structure of credit and loyalty he has built, a scaffolding of trust spanning Florence and far beyond. When the time comes, the ledger will close under one hand and open under another. The city will look up from its trade and its arguments and realize that a quiet shift has taken place. The Medici Bank is no longer the work of a single careful man. It belongs to his son now, to Cosimo, who has watched and listened and learned in the half-light of counting rooms and council halls. And as Florence steps deeper into an age of both danger and opportunity, the question hanging over every street, every church, every workshop is simple and electric. What will this new Medici choose to do with the power he has inherited? Cosimo, the invisible prince. Cosimo de' Medici steps into a Florence already tuned to the sound of his family's name. The streets he walks as a grown man are the same narrow arteries of stone his father knew, but the heartbeat feels louder now. The clang of metal from the workshops, the calls in the market, the distant rumble of cart wheels over bridges, all of it seems to echo with quiet questions. Who holds the debt of this guild? Who financed that shipment of grain? Who keeps the city's credit afloat when war or plague nudge it toward the brink? If you listen closely, the answer is often the same: the Medici Bank. Cosimo carries that invisible weight with a calm that others mistake for softness. He does not swagger like a conqueror. His clothes are fine but not ostentatious. His voice is measured, his gestures controlled. He attends mass. He pays respect to guild elders. He walks among the people with the ease of someone who understands that power displayed too openly in a republic can be as dangerous as a drawn sword in a crowded room. Yet behind the modest manners stands a man of sharp memory and sharper judgment, a man who has grown up reading not just ledgers but faces. In the great hall of the Palazzo della Signoria, where Florence's government meets, the air is always thick with dust, with heat, with unspoken hostility. Here, noble families measure each other with careful eyes. The Albizzi, long dominant, sit with the confidence of habit. They see the Medici as upstarts, merchants who have reached too high. Cosimo, listening from his place among the citizens, says little. He watches instead, taking in how votes are cast, how alliances shift, how fear moves from one side of the room to the other like a shadow when bad news arrives from the city's borders. Outside those walls, he works at another kind of politics. In the Medici Bank, Cosimo refines what his father began. He increases the reach of their branches, strengthens their ties to Rome, and cultivates a reputation for reliability that feels almost like inevitability. City officials come to him discreetly when the treasury runs low. Guilds seek his help to weather slow seasons. Even families who despise the Medici privately acknowledge that when it comes to loans and letters of credit, there is no safer name, however much it may gall them to admit it. He understands something that few others grasp in full. In a commercial republic, money is not merely a tool. It is a language, one that can say, "I support you," or "I can destroy you," without a single public word. A favorable loan might mean the survival of abusi ness and the loyalty of its owner for decades. The refusal of credit can quietly choke a rival. Cosimo begins to weave these decisions into a coherent strategy, building not just profit but a network of gratitude and dependence stretching across Florence's social classes. Yet he is not satisfied with being only a banker. There is another current moving through the city now, a hunger not just for wealth but for beauty. The cathedral still waits for its impossible dome. Its vast, circular opening gapes at the sky like an unanswered question. Engineers and architects have tried to solve the problem and failed. To roof such a space seems folly. To leave it unfinished seems shameful. Florence's pride hangs in the balance, suspended between stone and air. Into this dilemma steps Filippo Brunelleschi, restless, stubborn, brilliant. He proposes a dome unlike any built before, a double shell supported by ingenious ribs and herringbone brickwork. Many call him insane. Some call him a dreamer. Cosimo, listening to the pitch in a crowded council room, hears something else: opportunity. To tie the Medici name to the completion of Santa Maria del Fiore is to bind his family to the very soul of Florence. Faith, architecture, and finance can meet in one daring curve of brick and mortar. Supporting Brunelleschi is not just an act of taste, it is a calculation. If the project succeeds, the dome will stand as a visible symbol that the city's greatness, its ambition, its trust in reason and innovation has been made possible in part by Medici backing. Cosimo navigates the competing interests delicately, ensuring that funds flow when they must, smoothing disputes, calming skeptics. He visits the construction site, watching cranes lift stones higher than any had been raised in living memory, listening to the shouted instructions, the creak of ropes, the breath of workmen pulling in unison. On one such visit, amid the dust and clamor, a lesser official mutters, "If this fails, they'll remember your name for ruin, not glory." Cosimo smiles slightly. "If we do nothing," he replies, "they will not remember us at all." That desire, not for fame in the noisy present, but for memory stretched into the future, guides many of his choices. He begins to extend his patronage beyond stone to flesh and paint. A young sculptor named Donatello carves bronze and marble with intensity, bringing biblical figures into startling human immediacy. Cosimo recognizes the power in such work. He commissions pieces, not for distant princes, but for Florence itself, placing them in churches and public spaces where every citizen can feel the shock of seeing a shepherd boy or a prophet as real as the man standing next to him in the street. The Medici palace, too, grows under his eye. It is not a fortress bristling with towers, but a strong, dignified building whose solid rusticated stone and measured rows of windows suggest both security and openness. Inside, courtyards admit light, and walls, once bare, begin to fill with frescoes. Storytellers in paint, sculptors in stone, and thinkers with manuscripts in hand find a welcome there. Over time, the palace becomes a quiet workshop of culture, a place where art and ideas circulate as freely as coin. But if art and architecture are Cosimo's brighter tools, he is also acutely aware of the darker currents swirling around him. The Albizzi, watching his influence expand, grow increasingly alarmed. They see the cathedral funded, artists supported, the poor assisted, all with Medici money. They hear their own allies murmur that Cosimo is good for the city, a phrase that in a republic can quickly be twisted into too important to oppose. That thought terrifies them. Whispers of conspiracy float through the halls of power. Old laws against tyranny, measures meant to protect the republic from any one man's dominance, are dusted off, their language sharpened like blades. In private chambers, men argue under low ceilings, candles burning low as they plot how to cut the Medici influence back down to a size they find tolerable. The moment comes with the suddenness of a summer storm. One autumn day, Cosimo is summoned to the Palazzo della Signoria under the pretext of discussing a matter of state. He goes, as he has many times before, his steps echoing on the worn stone stairs, the air smelling faintly of ink, sweat, and the oil of old wood. But something is different. Guards at the door stand a little straighter, voices hush as he passes. Inside, accusations are waiting. He is charged with seeking to dominate the Republic, of using his wealth to buy undue influence, of luring Florence toward a new kind of tyranny wrapped not in armor but in velvet. The Albizzi press for swift action. Exile. Perhaps worse. They argue that to save Florence, they must cut out this spreading Medici root before it cracks the foundations of their fragile freedom. Cosimo listens, face still, heart pounding slowly like a muffled doctor. He knows that this is the moment his father's careful web has led to, the test of whether debts and gratitude can be as strong as armed men and shouted accusations. At the end of the day, he is led away, not to his home, but to a small, high room in the palazzo, a kind of honor prison reserved for citizens of stature while their fate is decided. The door closes behind him with a heavy thud. Alone, he steps to the narrow slit of a window and looks out at his city. The rooftops spread below like a sea of uneven waves. The unfinished dome cuts a great curve of sky, its rising shell catching the last light of evening. Somewhere out there, in houses and taverns and churches, are men whose fortunes he has guarded, whose crises he has eased, whose dreams he has quietly financed. Somewhere out there, rivals are sharpening their knives of words and law. Florence breathes on, indifferent and yet utterly intertwined with his fate. In the darkness of that high room, with the smell of stone and old wood pressing close, Cosimo must ask himself a question more dangerous than any line of figures. Has he built enough trust to survive the envy he has provoked? The answer comes not from prayers whispered in that narrow cell, but from corridors and courtyards he cannot see. While Cosimo waits in the dim, dust-smelling room, Florence begins to argue with itself. The Albizzi press hard for his destruction, demanding a death sentence or permanent exile. To them, this is a chance to cut down a rival whose roots have reached too deep into the soil. But outside the palace walls, others pace and murmur. Merchants whose debts he has extended, guild leaders whose crises he has eased, ordinary citizens who know that when the harvest was bad or the treasury thin, it was Medici gold that kept their city from breaking. In private, older men speak in low tones. If you destroy him, one warns an Albizzi ally, you destroy half the city's credit with him. Who will trust Florence then? Another adds, We may hate his power, but we rely on it. Remember that before you pull the roof down over all our heads. The debate reaches a fragile compromise. Cosimo will not die, but he will be exiled, banished from Florence under threat of harsher punishment if he dares return. The sentence is meant to break him, to strip him of influence, to show that no man, not even a banker beloved by many, stands above the Republic's laws. The door of his high room opens one morning with a long grind of hinges. A guard informs him of the decision in clipped words: exile. Only a few days to arrange his departure. Cosimo listens, his face unreadable. Inside, disappointment twists like a knot, but he says only, "Very well." When he steps back into Florence's streets, it is not as a savior or a master, but as a man marked for departure. People watch from windows and doorways as he passes. Some bow their heads. Some look away, afraid of being seen offering sympathy. A few, bold and angry, mutter that no one should have so much power, that the city is better off without him. Cosimo does not stop to argue. He walks to his home one last time, the familiar stones of the courtyard seeming sharper, the air colder. Inside, chests are packed, papers hidden or sent ahead. The great ledger, symbol of everything his family has built, does not travel with him. It stays under the care of trusted associates. Even in exile, Cosimo intends that the Medici Bank will continue to operate. Power, he knows, can sometimes travel better on paper than in person. He leaves Florence for Venice, the queen of the Adriatic, where stone palaces rise from water and trade flows in endless tides. The journey itself is long, the road hard, but the exile is not poverty. Cosimo is received politely in Venice, for Venetians understand money and politics all too well. He walks along canals, watches boats glide by loaded with goods from as far as the east, and listens to voices speaking in half a dozen languages. He does business, he waits, and he thinks. In letters written in a careful hand, he keeps contact with his allies in Florence. Ink replaces his physical presence. "Be patient," he writes. "The city cannot long bear those who mistake their fear for wisdom. Let the Albazi govern. Let them face the crises that come." Between the polite phrases, another message runs like a hidden thread. The networks he has built, the debts of gratitude and coin, are not so easily erased by a decree. Back in Florence, storms gather. The Albazi, having pushed their rival from the city, now must prove they can manage without him. They discover what Cosimo already knew, that pulling down a pillar is easier than replacing it. The economy struggles. Discontent grows. When war and diplomatic missteps strain the city's resources, citizens begin to ask, in whispers at first, then more loudly, "Did we exile the wrong man?" In taverns and workshops, the talk shifts. Remember when grain still came in during bad seasons? Someone asks, "Remember who arranged that?" Another answers, "Say what you like about the Medici, they never let the city starve." Pressure builds. The same political mechanisms that pushed Cosimo out begin to turn in reverse. Factions realign. Former opponents, calculating their own survival, decide that perhaps the Medici are less dangerous than the instability now gnawing at the city. Petitions are drawn up. Envoys are sent. A message reaches Cosimo in Venice: "Come home." When he returns to Florence, it is not to a quiet hallway or a small counting room. Crowds gather at the gates, their voices rising like surf against the old stone. They cheer not just for the man, but for what he represents: stability, credit, a sense that the city's fortunes are once again linked to a steady hand. The Albazi fall from power, some into exile themselves, others into obscurity. The wheel has turned. Cosimo now is more than a banker. He is something new, something Florence has not quite had words for yet. Not a king, the city still calls itself a republic. Not a dictator, there are councils and elections, rituals of shared rule. Yet everyone knows that decisions bend around him, that his opinion carries a weight no one else's does. He holds no formal crown, but in the streets and courtyards people talk of him as if he were a kind of prince. Later generations will call him Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland. He is careful to wear that invisible crown lightly. He continues to walk among the people, to listen to petitions, to lend money wisely, to show public piety. But his vision is larger now. He has felt the fragility of power, the ease with which envy can break it, and he understands that if the Medici are to endure, they must root themselves in more than gold and ink. They must tie their name to something Florence treasures so deeply that to attack the family would feel like attacking the city's own soul. So he deepens his investment in art and learning. The Medici Palace becomes a gathering place for scholars who study ancient Greek texts, for humanists who argue late into the night about virtue, governance, and the nature of man. Books arrive from distant monasteries, their pages scented with dust and lamp oil. Cosimo funds the copying of manuscripts, the founding of libraries. He understands that ideas, like credit, can circulate and transform those who touch them. In churches and public spaces, new works of art appear, frescoes glowing with color, altarpieces that blend spiritual fervor with human tenderness. Cosimo does not sign these works with his name, but many understand who paid the painters, who ensured that pigments and plaster were bought, who kept the workshops open. When people raise their eyes in wonder at a new chapel ceiling, they are, in some deep sense, also looking at Medici power made visible. At home, in quiet moments, Cosimo moves through his palace and hears the interplay of sounds that define his life. The scratch of quills in the banking rooms, the murmur of theological and philosophical debate in the library, the rhythmic chisel strikes from a sculptor shaping stone in a courtyard. Money, thought, and beauty, three strands that he weaves together with deliberate care. He grows older. His hair grays, the lines on his face deepen. He has sons now and grandsons. He watches them play in halls hung with tapestries, listens to their questions, measures their tempers. One of them, a boy with an intense gaze and a quick mind, draws his particular attention. Lorenzo. There is something in him, a charm, a curiosity, a restless desire to touch and taste every aspect of life that reminds Cosimo of what Florence itself is becoming. In the end, as illness begins to close around him like a slow tide, Cosimo withdraws slightly from public life, but his influence does not fade. When he dies, Florence does something strange for a republic wary of individual greatness. It mourns him like a ruler. Crowds fill the streets. Bells toll, each note heavy with the knowledge that an era is ending. On his tomb are carved the words that seal his unofficial title, Father of the Fatherland. Yet even as stone is set over his body, another story is beginning. The structures he built, the bank, the webs of patronage, the idea that art and power can walk hand in hand, do not vanish with him. They pass into the hands of those who have watched and learned. Among them stands Lorenzo, who will take what his grandfather made and push it further, faster, brighter, until the line between magnificence and danger becomes almost impossible to see. Somewhere in the Medici Palace, a teenage boy walks past a half-finished painting in a corridor lit by afternoon light. He pauses, stares at the vivid colors, and smiles with a kind of fierce delight, as if he sees not just the image on the wall, but a vision of what Florence itself could become. In that moment, the city's story tilts again, toward a new one in which One will not only build domes and chapels, but will conjure entire mythologies on plaster and canvas, all in the service of a single family's name. Lorenzo the Magnificent and the Art of Power. By the time Lorenzo de' Medici comes of age, Florence has already been tuned, string by string, by his grandfather and father. The city is still a republic on paper, still a place of guilds and councils and votes, but beneath the formal structures lies a subtler music. Notes of obligation, gratitude, envy, and hope all circle around one central name, Medici. Lorenzo grows up hearing that music not as a distant echo, but as the sound in his own house. The murmur of petitions in the courtyard, the rise and fall of his father's voice discussing loans and alliances, the soft rustle of parchment carrying decisions that will ripple through streets he has not yet walked as a man. From his earliest days, Lorenzo's world is split between two kinds of spaces. One is the counting room, cool, shadowed, lined with ledgers. There he watches numbers march across pages, watches the careful way clerks form each figure, knows that a single careless stroke could cost a man his livelihood. The other is the palace courtyard and garden, warm, filled with light and color, the air smelling of orange blossoms, wet stone, and new paint. There he meets poets reciting verses about ancient heroes, hears music under arched loggias, and sees young artists try to capture the curve of a shoulder or the fall of a robe in charcoal and clay. Lorenzo is quick, curious, and hungry for experience. He rides hard, plays sports with the vigor of any other young Florentine, and laughs easily. But he also listens. He listens to humanists reading from Plato, to old men recalling the days before the Medici rose, to widows explaining how a loan saved them from ruin. He understands something that will shape his entire life. Stories move people as surely as money does. A poem can soften a heart. A painting can fix an image in a mind forever. A festival can make a whole city forget, for a night, its grievances. When his father, Piero, called the gouty for his failing health, dies, the weight that has passed from Giovanni to Cosimo now settles on Lorenzo's shoulders. He is young, not yet hardened by age. Some whisper that he is too young, too fond of pleasure, too poetic for the hard work of power. Others see in him a chance for a new kind of Medici rule, less cautious than Cosimo's, more dazzling. Lorenzo, standing in a palace room filled with murmuring relatives and allies, feels both the eyes and the expectations on him like an invisible cloak. He does not refuse it. Stepping into leadership, Lorenzo decides almost instinctively that he will govern not only with balance sheets, but with spectacle. Florence under his hand will not merely function, it will shine. Public festivals grow more elaborate. On feast days, the streets blaze with banners and garlands. Plays are staged in churches and squares, with moving stages and ingenious machines that lower angels from the ceiling in showers of fake stars. Torches flare against night, throwing light on faces turned upward in wonder. Behind each dazzling scene there is careful accounting. Carpenters and painters must be paid, costumes sewn, musicians hired. Lorenzo signs the orders, knowing that every lira spent is also an investment, not only in joy but in loyalty. A city that associates your name with beauty, with brilliant evenings and memorable sights, will forgive much. It will remember you not as a cold collector of debts, but as the man who made life feel richer, even if only for a moment. Inside the Medici palace, his patronage grows bolder. Botticelli, with his delicate lines and dreamlike faces, brings to life mythological scenes that would have startled Lorenzo's more conservative ancestors. On canvas, goddesses walk in flower-strewn meadows, winds blow softly over seas that never existed, and the ancient world seems to bloom again in oil and tempera. Lorenzo sees in these works not blasphemy, but possibility, a way to join Christian devotion with human beauty, to suggest that Florence itself is a kind of new Olympus where the best of antiquity has returned. In the family gardens, blocks of marble stand like sleeping giants waiting to be woken. Young sculptors chip and smooth and mutter to themselves as they work. Among them, a sharp-eyed teenager watches every curve of muscle and bone with almost painful intensity. His name is Michelangelo. Lorenzo notices him, not just for his skill, but for the fierce seriousness with which he studies everything around him. He invites the boy deeper into the household, gives him access to ancient statues and drawings, offers him not just money, but a world to learn from. The palace becomes a kind of unofficial academy. At dinner, scholars debate the nature of virtue while Lorenzo listens, occasionally throwing in a line of poetry or a pointed question that steers the talk toward the practical. If Plato lived in Florence, he might ask, half smiling, how would he balance justice and profit? Laughter follows, but the question hangs in the air, unsettling and intriguing. For all the elegance and pleasure, danger still coils like a snake in the shadowed corners of Florence. Other families watch the Medici with eyes that have grown only more suspicious across the decades. The Pazzi, wealthy bankers in their own right, feel particularly squeezed. Each Medici triumph, another festivity, another chapel adorned, Another law passed with Lorenzo's quiet backing presses on their pride. In the cathedral, the unfinished dome now stands complete, a massive shell of brick and stone crowned with a lantern that gleams in the sun. Inside, light spills down into the nave in a way that makes even hardened men feel small and thoughtful. Priests intone mass beneath that soaring vault, but not all are pleased with what they see beyond the liturgy. Some mutter that Florence thinks too much of itself, that Lorenzo has turned the city into a stage for his own glory. They see pagan themes creeping into art, hear songs at banquets that praise Venus as often as the Virgin, and wonder if God will tolerate such blending of heaven and human desire. In private rooms, far from the music and laughter of Medici-sponsored feasts, hands slam onto tables. He buys the people, a Pazzi partisan spits, pacing in agitation. He wraps tyranny in garlands and calls it love for Florence. Others nod, their faces set. No one speaks openly of overthrow, not yet, but the thought is there, circling like a hawk waiting for the right wind. Lorenzo senses the hostility but does not shrink from it. He walks the streets unarmored, nods to butchers and scholars alike, attends public debates, visits monasteries. He believes that his closeness to the people and the sheer force of his charm are armor enough, and for a time they are. Children wave when he passes. Poets write verses comparing him to ancient statesmen. Artists tuck subtle tributes to him into the corners of their works, a Medici emblem here, a familiar profile there. Yet beneath the surface, two visions of Florence are pulling away from each other. One sees a city of festivals, philosophy, and art, guided by the generous hand of a single family. The other longs for a stricter, more equal, more visibly devout republic, where no man's name looms so large over the rest. It is in the space between these visions that a plot begins to take shape, a plan that will turn the holiest moment of the Christian week into a stage for blood. On a Sunday morning, while bells call the faithful to Mass and families pull on their best clothes, whispers in certain palaces grow more urgent. Swords are checked under cloaks. Letters are burned after reading. A few men, pale but resolved, practice in their minds the movements they will make when the moment comes, a step forward, a hand on a shoulder, a blade drawn in a single, decisive arc. And above them all, the great dome of Santa Maria del Fiore stands serene, a masterpiece raised with Medici-backed funds, about to witness the most violent test, yet of what that power has created. They gather beneath the shadow of Brunelleschi's dome, masked not by cloth but by piety. Mass has begun. Incense coils through the air like a living thing, carrying notes of frankincense, myrrh, and the faint tang of burning wax. The choir's voices rise in layered harmony, echoing up into the vault where sound seems to shimmer before dissolving. Florence is at worship, and in the minds of ordinary citizens, this is the one place where earthly rivalries should fall silent. But on this morning, silence is a prelude to something else. Lorenzo and his younger brother, Giuliano, arrive dressed simply but elegantly, as is their custom. Their mother kisses each on the cheek before they disappear into the swarm of worshippers. Lorenzo moves through the crowd with the easy grace of a man who belongs nowhere more than among his own people. Giuliano, warm-hearted and slower to suspicion, smiles broadly at those who greet him. Their footsteps echo softly on the stone floor as they take their places near the front, beneath frescoes whose saints look down with unblinking eyes. Nearby, men shift in their seats. Their breathing is shallow. Their prayers are whispers spoken with trembling lips, not for penitence but for courage. Among them is Francesco di Pazzi, proud, ambitious, and desperate. He has convinced himself and others that the Medici must fall for Florence to be free again. In his doublet, hidden at the ribs, is a knife. The metal presses cold against his skin. The priest's voice rises, "Pax vobiscum." And then a signal, a movement too small for most to notice, but for those waiting it is everything. In the space of a heartbeat, the sacred is shattered. Francesco lunges toward Giuliano. Another conspirator moves toward Lorenzo. The choir. Hymn falters as screams slice through the air. The congregation sways and buckles like a field struck by sudden wind. Giuliano tries to rise to defend himself, but the blow comes swift and deep. Blood spills across the marble, bright as spilled paint, shocking in its brilliance. The world tilts for him, the arches above blur. Lorenzo turns at the sound, a wet, sharp gasp from his brother, and sees the blade rise again. Instinct saves him where planning does not. He twists away from the attacker's grasp, and the knife meant for his throat slices instead across his shoulder, burning hot. Pain erupts, sudden and sharp, but he moves through it. He pushes against the press of bodies, shoving benches aside. His companions close around him, forming a living shield. They drag him toward the sacristy as chaos explodes in the nave. People scatter. Mothers pull children beneath pews. Priests shout for calm, their voices drowned by sobs and the heavy thud of feet. Under the vast dome built to honor God, Florence has become a battlefield. Inside the sacristy, walls of carved wood and polished stone become Lorenzo's refuge. His breath comes fast, tinged with the coppery scent of his own blood. A friend binds his wound with torn fabric. Someone bars the door. Outside, the uproar continues, cries of grief, shouts of rage, the echo of metal striking stone. Lorenzo presses a hand to his wound, not out of fear for himself, but for what this moment means. He does not yet know if Giuliano lives. He does not know how far the conspiracy reaches, whether guards in the streets have already decided their allegiance, or whether the Pazzi intend not merely assassination but full revolt. He knows only this. The city he has loved, fed, adorned, and protected is tearing itself apart beneath the very dome his family helped raise. Time passes like dripping wax, slow, irregular, unbearable. Then a messenger arrives, pale, trembling, his voice breaking as he speaks the words that will haunt Lorenzo forever. Giuliano is dead. The sacristy seems to tilt. The weight of grief is sudden, crushing. Giuliano's laughter, warm, open, so unlike Lorenzo's controlled composure, echoes in his mind. His brother, his closest companion, struck down not in battle but in prayer. There is no time to mourn, only time to act. When Lorenzo finally leaves the sacristy, escorted by loyalists armed with makeshift weapons, the cathedral steps are crowded with a city struggling to understand what has happened. The Pazzi conspirators, expecting a swift victory, find instead a rising storm of outrage. Word spreads with wildfire speed. The Medici have been attacked in church. Giuliano is slain. Lorenzo lives. The last part, Lorenzo lives, is a spark that transforms fear into fury. Within hours, Florence chooses its side, and it chooses Lorenzo. Crowds surge through the streets, hunting those who sought to destroy their city's de facto leader. The bells of the Palazzo della Signoria ring not for worship, but for justice or vengeance, depending on who tells the story. Pazzi men are dragged from hiding. Some are seized before they can flee, others are torn from their own homes. Francesco de' Pazzi is captured at last. His end is swift and brutal, carried out not by politicians or clerks, but by a furious populace that sees in him the embodiment of treachery. By nightfall, the rebellion is extinguished. The Medici not only survive, they ascend. When Lorenzo stands before the Signoria in the hours after the violence, the city bruised and trembling, he speaks not with the voice of a wounded man, but with the steady clarity of someone who has already begun to transform tragedy into authority. Florence, he says quietly, will not be broken. His brother is dead. His shoulder bleeds beneath fresh bandages, but his gaze is level, fierce with resolve. The room, filled with men who have seen more death in the last 12 hours than in many years combined, listens in somber silence. The conspiracy meant to topple him has instead cemented him more firmly than ever at the heart of Florence's fate. He has become, in the people's eyes, not merely a leader of wealth and taste, but a survivor, a man who has suffered for the city as much as he has beautified it. And yet in the quiet after the storm, as the dead are counted and the blood is washed from cathedral floors, something new enters Lorenzo's heart. Not fear that has passed, not triumph that would be hollow, but an understanding colder and deeper than either. Power, he realizes, must be guarded not only with generosity and art, but with vigilance. Beauty cannot exist without the shadow that protects it. From this day forward, Lorenzo's Florence will be brighter than ever and more tightly controlled. The Renaissance will blaze, fueled by his patronage. But behind the canvases and marble will stand a man who has learned, in a single shattering morning, that the cost of glory is always paid in flesh. In the months after the blood on the cathedral floor dries, Florence tries to return to its rhythms. The markets reopen, looms clatter, children chase each other through alleys, their laughter sharp against the stone. But something in the air has changed. The city has seen how quickly prayer can turn into panic, how the swing of a knife can redraw its future in an instant. Lorenzo walks through these streets carrying that knowledge inside him like a second heartbeat. He leans harder into the tools he knows best. Art and spectacle become not just expressions of taste, but instruments of stability. The festivals grow more elaborate still. On certain nights, the Arno glows with the reflection of hundreds of lights as boats drift along, hung with lanterns and filled with singers. Costumed riders parade through the squares, embodying heroes from ancient Rome and myth. The line between theater and politics blurs until it is almost invisible. The message beneath the music and color is simple. Under Lorenzo, Florence is alive, vibrant, blessed with abundance. Yet behind the shimmering surface, trouble seeps into the foundations. The Pazzi conspiracy was not only a personal attack, it was tied to broader rivalries. Pope Sixtus IV, who backed the Pazzi interests, had already begun to withdraw Medici control over certain papal finances. The bank loses a vital stream of income. Some branches, pressed by bad loans and local downturns, begin to wobble. Reports arrive from Bruges and London, merchants defaulting, political tensions disrupting trade. The numbers in the family ledgers no longer flow as smoothly from black to black. Red ink appears in thin, worrying lines. Lorenzo sees the danger. He tightens control, centralizes decision-making, and uses every scrap of his political sway to secure new advantages. Sometimes that means pressuring allies. Sometimes it means sacrificing a branch to save the core. Clerks who once wrote with easy confidence now glance at each other when a letter from abroad is opened, searching in their master's face for signs of reassurance. The strain does not stay locked in counting rooms. It presses against the edges of public life. Taxes are adjusted. Loans are called in more strictly. Whispered complaints begin to circulate that the Medici spend too much on poetry and painters, on festivals and marble, while the bank beneath all this glitter groans. To some, Lorenzo still seems a golden figure, a benefactor whose very presence makes them feel part of a grand story. To others, he begins to look like a man feasting in a house whose beams are starting to crack. Beyond Florence, Italy is a chessboard of restless powers. Naples, Milan, Venice, the Papal States, each watches the others with wary eyes. War always lurks just beyond the horizon, a few bad decisions away. When conflict threatens Florence, Lorenzo does something few leaders would dare. He walks into the lion's den alone. The King of Naples, Ferrante, is not a man known for mercy. His dungeons are rumored to be crowded. His temper is feared. Yet Lorenzo boards a ship and sails south, placing his own life as the pledge for peace. The sea air is salt and cold on his face as Florence recedes behind him. He knows that if Naples chooses to make an example of him, there will be no quick rescue, no miracle. He goes anyway. In Ferrante's court, surrounded by marble, tapestries, and the hard eyes of men who weigh every word, Lorenzo becomes once again what he has always secretly been, a negotiator of debts. This time the debt is not measured in florins, but in blood and cities. He speaks of shared interests, of the cost of war, of the glory in preserving stability rather than shattering it. He wears no armor, carries no sword, but his tongue and his composure are weapons honed over years of balancing favors and obligations in Florence. When he returns home alive, having secured terms that spare the city from devastation, Florence exhales as one. Gratitude spills out in shouts, in smiles, in the songs of poets comparing him to ancient peacemakers. His legend swells. The Magnificent, they call him now, not only for his love of art but for this single, audacious act. Still, even legends cannot ignore arithmetic. The bank continues to suffer. Some failures can be disguised, postponed, covered by clever arrangements. Others cannot. The Medici trading house in Bruges collapses. Losses there ripple back to Florence like a delayed wave. Lorenzo responds as he always has. By doubling down on the realm he can control most completely, culture. He commissions more. Botticelli's mystical visions grow stranger, more intense. Philosophers in Lorenzo's circle begin to weave Christian thought and Platonic ideals into a new, heady blend, speaking of the soul's ascent through beauty. Sculptors refine human bodies in marble until veins seem to pulse under stone skin. In his gardens and halls, Lorenzo watches all this and feels both pride and a creeping uneasy can. Not quite name. The people for the moment still adore him. They pack the streets for his processions. They repeat his verses. They speak of his generosity when a dowry is paid, a hospital funded, a scholar given a post. But in some corners of the city, a different voice begins to rise, one that cuts through silk and song alike. In the pulpit of the Dominican convent of San Marco, a friar from Ferrara named Girolamo Savonarola begins to preach. His sermons are not gentle. He speaks of corruption, of the wrath of God, of a church too in love with gold and painting. His words fall like hammer blows on the idea that beauty can excuse decadence. Crowds flock to hear him. Some leave shaken. Others leave angry, muttering that he dares to criticize the very man who has given Florence so much. Lorenzo hears of Savonarola. At first he treats him almost as another curiosity in the human tapestry he has woven, an intense, severe thread against the softer colors. He even supports him in part, seeing value in spiritual renewal that does not yet directly threaten his rule. But the friar's warnings grow louder, more pointed. He begins to describe visions of swords, of cities aflame, of a new scourge that will sweep away corrupt rulers. Listeners whisper a name in connection with these prophecies more and more often: Medici. The Magnificent is not immortal. Illness creeps into his life gradually, then all at once. Gout bends his joints. Fevers wring him out. The man who once danced and rode and talked until the candles guttered now moves more slowly through his own palace. In quiet rooms at Cergi, the family villa outside the city, Lorenzo lies in bed and listens to the sounds of Florence carried on the wind. Distant bells, faint shouts, the hum of a city that has never truly slept. He knows that the bank is weaker than it should be. He knows that foreign powers are shifting, that hungry kings across the Alps eye Italy's wealth. He knows that Savonarola's voice has not faded, but grown. And he knows that he will not be there to face what is coming. Visitors come to his bedside. Family, old allies. Some speak of practical matters, succession, accounts, alliances. Others simply sit and hold his hand, remembering festivals and poems and the early days when everything seemed to be rising at once. Depending on who tells the story, Savonarola himself may or may not have stood there, offering spiritual comfort on harsh conditions. What matters more than any single scene is the mood. A sense of a great performance nearing its end, the curtain about to fall even as the theater trembles. In 1492, Lorenzo de' Medici dies. The city mourns sincerely and loudly. Shops close. Prayers are said. Artists and poets feel as though a shade has been drawn across their brightest window. Yet beneath the grief lies uncertainty sharp as broken glass. Without Lorenzo's balancing act, who will hold together the tension between sumptuous art and fragile finance, between political reality and poetic dream? Who will face the storms gathering beyond Florence's walls, storms of foreign armies and religious upheaval? Far from the Arno in Rome, A new Borgia Pope will soon take the throne. Across the ocean, a Genoese sailor named Columbus is returning from a voyage he believes has found a new route to Asia. The world is turning, in ways Lorenzo could not fully foresee. And in the corridors of the Medici Palazzo, the bank's ledgers grow thinner while new maps of influence stretch toward loftier, more dangerous heights: cardinals' hats, papal tiaras, crowns. The age of the merchant prince is giving way to something grander and more unstable, an era in which the Medici will no longer be just the financiers of power, but will try to sit inside its very heart. The stage is shifting from Florence to Rome. The family that once quietly counted coins for popes will soon wear the fisherman's ring themselves. But if they become bankers of God, what happens when heaven's currency falters and earthly debts come due? Bankers of God, popes, wars, and a crumbling ledger. The road to Rome is lined with dust and expectation. Long before a Medici ever wears the papal crown, their money walks this route in sealed letters and guarded chests. Pilgrims come to the city for salvation. Merchants come for profit. The Medici come for both, and for something stranger: the chance to turn their talent for numbers into spiritual authority stamped in lead and gold. Rome in the late 15th and early 16th centuries is not the calm center of Christendom imagined in sermons. It is a construction site and a battlefield of ambition. Hammers ring against stone from dawn to dusk as new palaces rise. Marble columns, stripped from ancient ruins, are hauled to build churches that shine with fresh plaster and gilded stucco. Cardinals glide through shaded courtyards in robes the color of coagulated blood, their fingers heavy with rings. Courtiers whisper in corners thick with the smell of incense, sweat, and expensive perfume. Into this world steps a Medici with a shrewd eye and a trained ear. Giovanni de' Medici, son of Lorenzo, raised on the rhythms of Florence but destined for a different stage. As a boy, he walked through his father's palace, past paintings and statues bought with bank profits. As a man, he climbs the steps of St. Peter's, wearing a cardinal's red, the weight of the church's hopes and hypocrisies pressing on his shoulders. He knows the Vatican's secrets in the same way his ancestors knew the hidden fears of Florentine merchants. Behind the Latin chants and the glow of candles lies a simple, relentless fact: the church is expensive. Wars against rival states, bribes to secure alliances, salaries for armies of servants and guards, massive building projects like the new St. Peter's Basilica, all of it demands money, always more money. In shadowed rooms, church officials discuss not only theology but yields and interest. They debate which banking house can be trusted to move funds across borders, to turn coin into bills of exchange and back again without loss or scandal. The Medici name, though dented by recent financial struggles, still carries an aura of reliability and sophistication. They have been bankers to God before, and men in Rome remember that. Giovanni watches and waits. He plays the long game. He builds friendships, extends credit, and uses a lifetime of training to judge when a favor granted will be repaid tenfold in influence. When he becomes Pope Leo X in 1513, elected by a college of cardinals who know his family's past as well as his own, he steps into a role that once seemed impossible: a Medici not just serving the papacy, but embodying it. On the day of his coronation, the city erupts, trumpets blare, banners ripple in the wind. Crowds press against barriers to catch a glimpse of the new pontiff as he is carried through Rome on a litter flanked by soldiers and surrounded by a haze of incense. Leo X lifts his hand in blessing, rings flashing in the sun. Inside, he feels the mix of awe and calculation that has defined his family for generations. "God has given us the papacy," he is rumored to have said. "Now let us enjoy it." Enjoyment for Leo is not just feasting and music, though there is plenty of both. It is the thrill of commissioning art on a scale even Lorenzo could only dream of. He calls Raphael to paint rooms in the Vatican, scenes where philosophers and saints, ancient and Christian, stand side by side in a vision of intellectual harmony. He supports Michelangelo's work on the vast, twisting ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. A universe of painted bodies and stories arched over the heads of cardinals and princes as they pray and plot. The Medici instinct has simply moved south, turning money into beauty and beauty into power. But in Rome, the stakes are higher. Here, the buyer is not just a city, but Christendom itself. To fund his artistic and political ambitions, Leo X reaches for the same financial tools his forebears refined in Florence and pushes them further. One instrument in particular will change history: indulgences. The idea is older than Leo. For years, the Church has offered spiritual benefits, the reduction of time in purgatory, in exchange for prayers, pilgrimages, and acts of charity. Over time, money begins to take the place of physical acts. Give generously to this church, this hospital, this crusade, and your soul, or a loved one's soul, may be eased. It is theology blended with bookkeeping, salvation connected to the ledger. Under Leo, indulgences become a major financial project. Envoys fan out across Europe selling them to peasants and princes alike, promising that generous donations will help build St. Peter's and secure heavenly mercy. Coins clink into coffers. Ledgers fill. In Rome, marble rises, frescoes bloom, music soars in chapels that seem to float on clouds of sound and gold leaf. But far to the north, in a small German town, a monk watches this trade with growing disgust. His name is Martin Luther, and he has the kind of conscience that does not bend easily. He sees poor people handing over precious savings for slips of paper. He hears preachers claim that souls leap from purgatory the moment coins hit the bottom of a chest. To him, it sounds less like mercy and more like manipulation. Luther takes up his pen. The hammer blows as he nails his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg in 1517, echo far beyond the wood. They echo in Rome's marble corridors, where Leo X hears that a German friar is challenging not only indulgences, but the authority of the Pope himself. They echo in banking houses, where men realize that if the church's spiritual credit collapses, its financial credit may follow. The Medici now find themselves entangled in a storm larger than any they have faced in Florence. This is not a rival family plotting in a cathedral. It is a movement of thought and faith tearing Europe in two. The Reformation, sparked in part by the very methods used to finance Medici art and papal policy, spreads like flame through dry brush. Princes seize on it to assert independence from Rome. Common people grasp at it as a way to strip away layers of ritual and wealth that have long felt oppressive. Leo X responds with bulls, councils, and threats of excommunication. He believes, as his family always has, that firm action and careful negotiation can control events. But this time, the forces he faces are not easily tamed. Printing presses scatter Luther's words faster than any courier can ride. Ideas, unlike coins, cannot be locked in chests. Meanwhile, the old story repeats itself in a new city. The Medici extend themselves too far. Wars, patronage, the endless costs of Rome eat away at resources. Bad loans and political miscalculations drag at the institutional Medici Bank, already weakened since Lorenzo's day. Branches falter. Some collapse outright. The image of the Medici as financial wizards remains bright in frescoes and ceremonies, but in the shadows of counting rooms, clerks scratch their heads and stare at columns of figures that no longer add up in their favor. After Leo X comes Clement VII, another Medici pope cautious where Leo was exuberant, but just as tangled in the dangerous currents of his time. He watches the Reformation harden into a permanent fracture, sees Henry VII break from Rome, and faces the rising threat of powerful monarchies in France, Spain, and the Empire. He is a banker turned shepherd trying to guide a flock that has already begun to scatter. In 1527, the unthinkable happens. Rome, the Holy City, is sacked by mutinous troops of the Holy Roman Emperor. Soldiers rampage through streets and churches, looting, killing, desecrating. Smoke rises over domes and palaces. Sacred spaces that once rang with music and Latin chants now echo with screams and the crash of falling statues. Clement VII barricades himself in the Castel Sant'Angelo, watching his city burn through narrow windows, feeling the weight of failure press on him as surely as any physical chain. A Medici who once helped clothe the papacy in majesty now witnesses its humiliation. The family's reach has never been greater, and its grip never felt weaker. In a small, dim office somewhere in Italy, a Medici banker opens a letter that smells faintly of smoke and dust. It carries news of ruin in Rome and requests for money to rebuild, to reconcile, to pay armies. He sets it down beside other letters, reports of failing branches, of reluctant borrowers, of changing laws. For the first time, perhaps, he allows himself to say what the numbers have been whispering for years. We are not what we were. But if the Medici ledger is cracking, another record is growing stronger, written not in ink, but in stone and paint. The art and architecture their money has set in motion. That record will outlast banks, popes, and empires alike. And as the 6 balls of the Medici crest fade from the fronts of counting houses, they reappear on the pediments of palaces and over the doorways of galleries, heralding anew in the family's story. Less about what they own, and more about what they will leave behind. The price of beauty, decline, legacy, and the invention of the Renaissance. When the dust settles over Rome and the echo of clashing armies finally fades into memory, the Medici stand changed. Not broken. Their name is too deeply woven into the continent's politics and culture for that, but diminished. What began as a wool merchant's steady rise has become a dynasty stretched thin across kingdoms, courts, and curias. The bank that once shaped European finance is now a hollow outline of its former self. Yet the Medici do not disappear. They transform. The center of gravity shifts back to Florence, where a new has already begun. The city Lorenzo, once filled with poetry, song, and pageantry, now faces a harsher reality. Foreign armies march through Italy with increasing boldness, and the fragile balance between its states collapses like stained glass under a thrown stone. Florence, proud of its republican traditions, briefly expels the Medici after the turmoil of the early 16th century, but politics move like tides. By 1530, with the backing of the Holy Roman Emperor, the Medici return, not as bankers or unofficial princes this time, but as hereditary dukes. The age of the merchant family is over. The age of the ruling house has begun. Cosimo I, great-great-grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent's brother, rises to power young and relatively unknown. Many in Florence expect him to be a puppet, manageable, malleable, forgettable. They underestimate him. Beneath the calm exterior is a steel forged by years of watching his elders fail or flee. He consolidates authority with precision, subdues rebellious nobles, reorganizes the army, and turns the Medici court into a center of power that rivals any in Italy. But the sea, Ost is visible too. The Florence Cosimo inherits is not the one Lorenzo knew. The marketplace hums, but cautiously. Artists still work, but fewer visionaries pass through the palace gates. The Medici Bank, once the beating heart of their influence, has ceased to exist as a meaningful force. What remains is the family name, their political authority, and their vast collection of art and treasures built across generations. Cosimo understands something essential. If the Medici cannot dominate banking anymore, they will dominate memory. They will shape how Florence sees itself. And so he institutionalizes the family legacy in a way none of his predecessors had envisioned. He commissions Giorgio Vasari, painter and architect, to redesign the city's civic spaces. Under Vasari's hand, corridors weave through the skyline, connecting the Palazzo Vecchio to the new offices of state, the Uffizi. These offices, ironically built for administration, will one day become one of the greatest art galleries in the world. Cosimo fills them with paintings, sculptures, and artifacts that once adorned private Medici halls. What had been personal becomes political. What was enjoyed becomes enshrined. Outside Florence, Europe is exploding with discovery. New continents open through sea voyages. Scientific ideas spread. Nations rise and fall. Italy, once the center of creativity, becomes a battleground for larger empires. Yet within the walls of the Uffizi and the Medici palaces, a golden past is being preserved, almost as if in defiance of the chaos beyond. Medici rulers in the following generations shift from patrons of new genius to curators of old brilliance. Some are cultured, some cruel, some indifferent, but all understand the value of what their ancestors gathered. They polish the family's cultural wealth even as their political power fractures. Grand Duke Ferdinando I fosters trade and builds elegant villas. Cosimo II supports Galileo, giving the astronomer protection when his ideas threaten to overturn the old cosmic order. Yet even this moment of brilliance foreshadows the end, for Galileo, like so many Medici clients, will eventually face tribunals more powerful than any Florentine court. By the 17th century, the Medici palace is quieter. The sound of chisel and brush, once the heartbeat of Medici patronage, fades. Painters still work, but they imitate more than they innovate. Sculptors polish marble that feels increasingly like a ghost of earlier greatness. The family hosts concerts and balls, but the energy that once surged through Florence has softened into ritual. Still, the Medici endure. Their survival now depends less on expanding influence and more on maintaining dignity. They marry into European royalty. They sit for portraits painted with increasingly formal poses, stiff, rich fabrics, heavy jewels, faces composed into expressions meant to convey authority even as real power slips away. Their decline is not sudden. It is a quiet dwindling, like a candle burning lower over decades. One generation produces fewer heirs. Another rules without passion. A third seems almost a caretaker of a name rather than a shaper of destiny. By the time the 18th century dawns, the once mighty house is running out of blood. Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, the last of her line, knows this. She walks through halls overflowing with art collected by men who financed cathedrals, survived conspiracies, argued with kings, and negotiated with popes. She hears her footsteps echo on marble floors once warmed by the presence of Botticelli, Michelangelo, Machiavelli, and Galileo. She feels the weight of history pressing on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. She cannot save her family, but she can save its legacy. In 1737, with no heirs to follow her, Anna Maria Luisa signs what will become one of the most extraordinary cultural agreements in European history, the Family Pact. In it, she bequeaths the entire Medici art collection, palaces, paintings, sculptures, treasures accumulated over centuries, to the people of Florence, on one condition. Nothing may ever be removed from the city. The legacy of the Medici, she decides, belongs not to princes or conquerors, but to Florence itself. The art will stay where it was created, loved, debated, and transformed. The Uffizi will remain a treasury of the Renaissance. The Pitti Palace and the Boboli Gardens will endure as monuments not just to Medici grandeur, but to the city's soul. When she dies, the Medici bloodline ends. No more grand dukes. No bankers to kings, no popes bearing their coat of arms. The 6 balls on the red shield become symbols in history books rather than active seals on decrees. Yet Florence remains filled with their echoes. Walk through the Uffizi, and you see Botticelli's Venus rising eternally from her painted sea, a vision funded by Lorenzo's gold. Stand beneath Michelangelo's David and feel the weight of marble shaped in a city W. Here Medici patronage shaped everything else too. Step into the Duomo and look up at Brunelleschi's dome. Impossible, had Cosimo not believed the future was worth the risk. The Medici did not invent genius, but they invented the conditions for the Renaissance to flourish. They built the scaffolding on which artists and thinkers climbed. They paid for risks that others feared to take. They understood, long before economics had a name for it, That investment in beauty yields a return measured not in coin, but in centuries. Their story begins in a counting room, with ink-stained hands and careful ledgers. It ends in galleries open to the world, where tourists stand with tilted heads, seeing in frescoes and marble the echoes of a family that shaped history with money, ambition, and imagination. If you listen closely in those halls, you might still hear it, the faint scratch of a quill, the whisper of parchment turning, the clink of a florin placed carefully on a wooden table. The first sounds of a Renaissance born not only in genius, but in credit. And somewhere in Florence, as the sun slips behind terracotta roofs and shadows lengthen across the Arno, the legacy of the Medici lingers in the air like the last note of a long, magnificent song. A reminder that beauty, once funded, never truly dies.